If everyone could begin taking your seats and please silence your phones. We're about to begin our panel discussion on containing nuclear renegades. It'll be moderated by Ann Guerin, and I'll hand it over to her from here.
Great. Thanks very much. Everybody hear me all right? Good. I will briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll go from there. We have roughly an hour, and I think there's going to be plenty to talk about. When we talk about containing nuclear renegades, I think the things that come most quickly to mind are North Korea and Iran. There's also the more diffuse threat and question of nuclear material that can get loose in the world and fall into the hands of terrorists, non-state actors, others who potentially be a threat to the United States. I think we'll cover all of those scenarios today, but we're going to start with North Korea. And let me do the introductions first. Actually, I did have one bit of housekeeping. I want to thank our sponsors for the day's forum, Congressmen McCall and Ruppersberger, and Senators Rubio and Coons. I think this is a really interesting idea that they've come up with here. They certainly got a murderer's row of panelists, and it's really interesting. I like the idea of it being a bipartisan sponsorship, and there's certainly a bipartisan and multidisciplinary aspect to the people they've invited here. So very interesting. I hope it keeps going. So our first panelist is Congressman Ed Royce, who is the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Just conducted a lengthy hearing last week with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson on the FY18 budget, which very quickly became a very lengthy discussion of North Korea, Iran, and other threats. So I think we'll talk a little bit about that. Tony Blinken, who's not next to Congressman Royce, who was the former Deputy Secretary of State, and prior to that served a lifetime of Democratic foreign policy roles, basically everything foreign policy to Joe Biden and then President Obama, and somebody who certainly knows how Congress works as well. John Wolfstall is the former director, not the current, as your playbook says here, former director of the NSC for Arms Control of Non-Proliferation in the most recent administration. Mike Singh had another senior director job at the NSC for George Bush as the senior director for the Middle East, which of course includes having a look from that vantage at the threat then posed by Iran. And Anthony Ruggiero is a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and a go-to for me for smart thoughts on proliferation issues involving both North Korea and Iran. Congressman, we'll start with you. We've just concluded the U.S.-China security dialogue, which is a Trump administration concoction that more or less replaces the old security and economic dialogue with the United States, which ran for about 10 years. And the idea behind it is that while the range of things that the United States has to talk about with China is vast, some of the security concerns are among the most pressing, and that those should be handled at a very senior level. To wit, this was an all-day discussion between Secretaries Tillerson and Mattis and their Chinese counterparts. And of course, North Korea was at or very near the top of that list. Congressman, can you just talk a little bit about what you think the administration's chief goals are here in dealing with North Korea, how China plays a role in that, and what advice have you given or are you giving them for dealing I think let's start with the China part of it particularly.
Yes, I have, and given some advice, unsolicited, but advice nevertheless, on, 90% of the subsidy comes through China. That keeps North Korea in the business of getting the hard currency it needs to continue its weapons program. Enormously expensive to build out a program like this. We know this from talking to the defectors who worked on the missile program and also the former chief propagandist who defected through China. And so their advice was always cut off the source of the currency needed, which would mean getting China to comply with the sanctions legislation that I passed here last year and that the National Security Council brought up. So we need enforcement of the National Security Council decision, which luckily Russia and China signed off on. And I think we've got to ask ourselves, why did they sign off? China's conflicted. On the one hand, they haven't brought themselves to cut off this currency, but on the other hand, they are concerned, based on my conversations with them in Beijing, they are concerned about the fact that South Korea or Japan or others might follow down this road of developing a nuclear program and a weapons program. There's something none of us want to see, right? And so here's the question. Are we willing to do what Stuart Levy, Undersecretary of the Treasury, did some years ago, which is go all the way and put those sanctions on financial institutions like the Banco de Delta Asia and give them that choice. You either do business with the United States or you do business with North Korea, but not both. And it is bankruptcy for any company or any financial institution that makes the wrong choice. And that's why those sanctions were effective when they were deployed. And frankly, we know again from speaking to defectors from the program, the missile program was shut down because they didn't have the money to buy the clandestine gyroscopes they needed on the black market and other parts. It was lifted later, but he also did not, the dictator at the time, Kim Jong-il, could not pay his generals, right? Not a good position, as the defector said, for the dictator to be in when you can't pay your generals. It's this kind of pressure that might give us in Beijing, if we deployed it, the ability to get them to quit the program or else face that implosion.
Let me ask you a follow-up there.
Yes.
You're talking about the efficacy of a set of sanctions that were applied, but a long time back in the evolution of the North Korean program, right? I mean, if the conversation is very different today.
But Ann, let us say this. We've gone meticulously through this, and I have another bill that we passed May 4th into the Senate that I'm trying to get the Senate to bring up and pass right now, 419-1. That bill would shut down the remaining accesses to cash. What primarily is this? It's primarily the use of indentured labor that they send overseas, especially to the Gulf states. And basically those people work for their meals over there, and the check is sent to the regime, $1.7 billion a year. It would shut that down, shut down the use of the shipping, North Korean shipping, the use of ports, and would deploy sort of these third-party sanctions against financial enterprises, banks in China that allow the transfer of hard currency. That bill needs to pass the Senate now so that it can be deployed.
Tony, you're nodding. Does that mean you agree with the idea that this type of sanctions, if tried again, could be effective?
Yeah, I mean, I find myself in violent agreement with the chairman on this. Here's the challenge for us. We've had successive administrations going back to the early 1990s that have tried and failed to curb North Korea's nuclear ambitions. But this has gotten even more urgent than it had been over those decades. Now, one parenthesis, there was a brief period in the 1990s with the agreed framework in which we did park their plutonium program for a number of years, but that unraveled for a variety of reasons, which we can get into later if anyone wants to. But bottom line is, we now have a regime that, particularly over the last year and a half, has been pressing the accelerator to get an ICBM that it can put a nuclear warhead on that can actually reach the continental United States. And the idea of that technology in the hands of a leader who, at best, acts impulsively and possibly even irrationally, although there's a debate about that, is not a place we want to be. If there were a good, neat military solution, we'd have to look at it. I don't see one. Much of the program is buried in mountains, deep underground. Some of it, we don't know where it is. Cyber tools, without getting into any details, may be able to delay or disrupt but not defeat the program. And even if we did have a strong preemptive option, we would risk a retaliatory salvo from the North Koreans with more than 10,000 pieces of artillery and rockets aimed at Seoul, South Korea. And whether anyone would want to pay that price, I think, is a big question mark. So the question then is, how do you get these guys back to the table? And I very much agree with the chairman that the only chance we have to do that is to exert sustained, comprehensive pressure. There are two pieces to this. One is China, as the chairman said. China says its influence has declined with North Korea. That may be true, but its leverage remains very strong for the reasons the chairman said. Virtually all of North Korea's trade and aid goes to, through, or is with China. Part of getting China to do more is to make China increasingly uncomfortable about what will happen if it doesn't. And in particular, we've said, and this started the last year of the Obama administration, in particular, we went directly to the Chinese, and the president said this to Xi Jinping very directly. The rest of us repeated it to our counterparts repeatedly. North Korea is now a core security interest of ours. You talk about Taiwan and Tibet. This is a core interest for us. You need to exert the leverage. If you don't, or if you can't, we're going to have to take a series of steps that are not directed at you, not aimed at you, but you're not going to like. Deployment of missile defense systems, including the THAAD. More exercises, more U.S. military presence, including with the South Koreans and Japanese in the region. And, as the chairman said, sanctions, including secondary sanctions that would affect Chinese entities. The second piece of this is also what I think is in the chairman's bill, and this is vitally important. And we started to do this, and I'm glad at the prospect of this being codified. But about a year ago, we established a quiet but very determined program with the South Koreans and with the Japanese, where we set up a working group. We met every single week, and our objective was to cut off every single economic, political, and diplomatic link that North Korea had with any other country in the world. And we went quietly from country to country together to get them to kick out the guest workers for the reasons the chairman said, to get them to kick out diplomats who are engaged in illicit commercial activities, to stop Air Koryo from landing, to stop the ships from porting, to get rid of the diplomats, to downgrade their relations. And we had significant success. We didn't advertise it because we didn't want to embarrass some of the countries in question. If you do all of this in a sustained way and in a comprehensive way, there's at least a chance that, again, for the reasons that the chairman said, you dry up the resources that Kim Jong-un needs both to pay for the program and buy off his elites. That, I think, is our best chance. Now, maybe that's a 30% chance. I don't see a better option.
Okay, following up on that, on his way out, your former boss, President Obama, impressed on Donald Trump that North Korea was, in his view, the origin of the single greatest imminent threat, sort of condensing it here. But in any event, he clearly got his point across, right? I mean, Donald Trump is rather, it appears, seized with the idea that North Korea is an imminent threat. What differences do you think the new administration has, basically, like, what's in its toolbox that might not have been in yours? What advice would you give going forward? And you mentioned the quiet diplomacy of trying to downgrade diplomatic relations. Tillerson has taken that public. Was that a good idea?
I think at the point where we're at, it may well have been. I've seen actually a lot of continuity in the policy. And the administration has, look, every administration will do this. They put old wine in a new bottle, say it's a new policy, but in fact, what they've been doing is pretty much a continuation of what we were doing, and I think it's basically the right thing to do. That said, it's actually in some ways tougher for them, in part because of the change in government in South Korea. We had absolutely no daylight between us and the South Korean government on the sustained pressure campaign toward the North under the previous government. This new government has a different approach. That makes it a little tougher for American diplomacy. That's one problem. The other thing is, and I think you alluded to this, Ann, obviously with the passage of time, this has gotten worse and worse and worse, and I think we have to probably be somewhat modest about what we can hope to achieve, at least initially. I think, at best, what we can hope to achieve in a first step is to get the North Koreans to freeze their testing program. Now, that would be a significant achievement, if only because if they freeze that program, it's going to be harder for them to get to the point where they actually have the technology that works to hit us. That buys you time, which in foreign policy may be the best thing you can do.
Okay. John, to you, could you give us your best assessment of something Tony referred to there a moment ago, the dual development efforts undertaken by North Korea? I promise for the Iran people in the room we will get to Iran. But this is a country that has had one form or another of a nuclear research and development program for a couple of decades, concurrent with an increasingly sophisticated missile, in other words, delivery program. Where do you plot on the plot, on the arc of terrible? Where do you plot those things? When do they converge? And essentially, how bad is it?
People always ask me to cheer them up, and
No.
I think there's still big questions about North Korea's current capacity. The challenge is not when will we know for sure that they can put a working, robust nuclear weapon on a missile that can reach all the way to the United States. They will claim that well before they have a capability that we would assume is reliable. But it does matter in terms of the strategic landscape for North Korean leadership to believe or to credibly announce that they can hold U.S. territory at risk through a ballistic missile changes the dynamic with North Korea. It changes the deterrent and reassurance relationship with South Korea and Japan. And so even if we don't know for sure that they've hit that point, they are getting closer and closer to it. And it's a different type of challenge because whereas 10, 15 years ago, we could reliably interdict, affect, deny them the ability to import these materials, over the last 5 years or so, North Korea has gone increasingly indigenous to the point where they are less reliant on imports. They still are desperately reliant on outside sources of income to fund not only the program but their entire state, and I'm in agreement with the chairman and Tony on needing to go after that aggressively. But we may have lost the ability to prevent them from having this program mature unless we're able to put some sort of freeze in place. Now, I am not optimistic that we will get a freeze, and I'm even less optimistic that if the North Koreans agree to a freeze, that it will stick and that will be a true comprehensive freeze. And so for that reason, I'm much more focused on how do we develop the strategy that communicates to North Korea what we now view as unacceptable behavior by the North, and how do we deter them from taking that behavior? For a long time, for as long as we've been working this problem, we've been focused on prevention, and we haven't spent enough time thinking about what is the deterrent message we need to convey. Is it direct attacks on South Korea that we're trying to prevent? Is it the proliferation of this technology to other countries, as we've seen in the past? Is it hiding behind the nuclear shield but undertaking low-intensity conflict? Is it cyber attacks? Until we understand what it is we're trying to prevent, we can't message that to the North Koreans, and then we can't hope to actually convince them to improve their behavior.
Anthony, can you follow up just a bit on the role of South Korea and THAAD and the change in government in South Korea? Just catch us up on where, because that's something that has changed, is changing right along with the new U.S. administration, and where do you think it's going?
Sure, I think it depends on which President Moon comes to the U.S. next week. Is it the President Moon that wants to not deploy THAAD and wants to restart the Kaesong industrial complex, which the prior government admitted provided $100 million a year to the North Korean regime that they probably use for their nuclear weapons and missile programs? Or is it the Moon that wants to talk about maybe thinking about those things until the North Koreans are ready to denuclearize, or it sounded like after they had denuclearized? It's hard to track what the parameters are. we've said this publicly. I mean, the Kaesong Industrial Complex, not only is it a bad idea, it's a violation of both UN and U.S. sanctions. So I think that if Moon comes here or after his visit says that he's moving forward on that, not only does it exploit North Korean labor, but it's going to further the nuclear weapons program. I just want to, I mean, on sanctions, I would just say that in the China visit yesterday, I mean, my biggest question is, what are we waiting for? I mean, I think Secretary Tillerson's comments were very good about North Korea's money laundering and other illicit activities, and the president's tweet the day before seemed to suggest that we're ready to move. The C4ADS report last week suggests that it's a small number of companies that would have to be gone after. I'm not sure. I mean, I know what we're not going to move. I mean, we haven't moved over 10 years. I'm certainly pessimistic on that. Republican and Democratic administrations have not moved against China, but that's really the only game in town. I mean, I guess I'd slightly disagree that North Korea has indigenous capabilities, certainly from a technology standpoint in terms of their ability to upgrade their ballistic missile program. But a couple of years ago, I think there was a study that the Yunhwa-3, the SLV launch, had a lot of Western parts in it. And the last thing I'll say is that we're nowhere near where we were on the Iran sanctions front. That we need to do a lot more on the shipping side. I mean, if you just want to know, anything you need to know is the SWIFT issue, that a European country could think it was a good idea to give North Korea access to a secure financial messaging service. That is the attitude, and that is the problem. And the UN itself said it's a violation of UN sanctions, and that is a microcosm of what we have to deal with.
Well, that's a nice way to pivot to Iran. And Mike, as someone who observed the whole JCPOA process from outside government, but nearby, what is your assessment now of how durable that agreement is, and whether it offers at this point enough potential benefits that the Trump administration is likely to keep it? What's your advice?
Well, thanks, Ann, and thanks, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think that, look, there's no doubt that the Trump administration, a lot of folks up here, a lot of those who are critics of the JCPOA, don't like this particular agreement. Why don't we like this particular agreement? For a few reasons. Because we thought that it allows Iran too much nuclear activity, doesn't take from them the nuclear weapons capability that they still possess. And it really defers the problem rather than solving it. Because as you look at this agreement, you ask, is it durable? It's important to remember that starting in just a few years, the restrictions on Iran will start to lift. So the restriction on selling arms to Iran will be lifted in, I think, about 4 years. The restriction on ballistic missile cooperation with Iran will be lifted in about 7 years. And bear in mind that we worry about North Korea developing an ICBM. For Iran, developing an ICBM probably requires some kind of external help, and lifting the sanctions will, of course, be problematic in that regard. And then other aspects of the agreement start to lift in 10 years. And of course, whatever the agreement says, I don't think any American administration, whether it's Republican or Democratic at that point, is going to be comfortable if Iran chooses to start rapidly expanding its nuclear program when it's allowed to do that. So the agreement, I think, doesn't sit well with the administration. That said, we're in a bit of a bind even if we don't like it, because if we were to step out of the agreement, unilaterally cancel it, first, it's not clear what effect that would actually have. It could be, and people would debate this, I think, pretty fiercely, that Iran and the other parties would just go on with the agreement, and the United States would sort of be on our own. And then the leverage would shift very much against us in a sense, because as long as we're in the agreement, we have, I think, some leverage to get other states to keep us in, right? To say, well, here's what we need if you want us to stay on board with this. Once you step out, then you've got to come up with a new policy and convince others to get on board with it. And there's no doubt that there's a sort of conundrum there. I think that the answer to that conundrum, the solution, is to use the text of the agreement in as maximal a way as you can, to sort of interpret it as strictly as you can, to sort of not give Iran some of the exemptions, to not overlook Iranian behavior, and to use some of the agreement's provisions to sort of push the envelope a little bit, to get inspections at sites that we want inspections at, to sort of push the IEA to maybe into some uncomfortable places for them. And then to work outside the agreement to buttress it, in a sense, to fix what I think the administration, myself, and other critics regard as weaknesses in the agreement. The fact that it doesn't cover, for example, ballistic missiles, which when I was working on this issue, we started the P5+1 process essentially in 2005. We deliberately included missiles at every step along the way, and I think we once again need to turn our attention to that problem to fix what I think critics would consider problematic access provisions for inspectors. And then, of course, to address the sunset provision, the expiration of the deal's restrictions, which is, I think, the biggest problem of all. And remember that the deal took 13 years to negotiate. We've got only about 9 years before it starts to expire. So really, we should be working on that part of it right now, rather than considering that a problem for down the road. I can't help, Ann, but to sort of say what are the connections between the Iran and North Korea deals? Because like everyone in Washington, I think I'm an expert on everything, so I'm not going to restrict myself to the Middle East.
Feel free.
I think that I agree with what the chairman said. I agree with Tony's take. I am, however, a bit of a killjoy when it comes to the sanctions question, because I'm very skeptical that we can muster enough economic pressure to convince Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapons, if that's our goal. I'm also even skeptical that a freeze-for-freeze type deal could succeed with the North Koreans. I think what enabled us to succeed with Iran, to the extent you consider the JCPOA a success, and I think a lot of people do, even though some of us are critics, is not just sanctions. The sanctions were powerful. There's no doubt about that. But we also made concessions. You know, I think what the Iranians wanted, most Iran experts would say, was not necessarily to have a nuclear weapon today. It was to preserve a nuclear weapons capability, a threshold capability,
Leverage.
while getting sanctions lifted. They essentially got that. And so there was this space for agreement between the United States, between the Obama administration and Iran, which was neither side wanted war. Neither side of the U.S. didn't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Iran was prepared to sort of not have a nuclear weapon for now. We were prepared instead to concede to Iran that nuclear weapons capability, which we had for a long time tried to deny them. So there was also that aspect of it. I'm not convinced that Kim Jong-un would ever give up his nuclear weapons. I'm convinced that he really wants a nuclear-armed ICBM because his behavior really suggests it. He seems to be willing to take a lot of risks for that. If that's the case, I'm not sure that any amount of economic pressure will get us there. And Chairman Royce talked about, well, it's either give up those weapons or everything collapses. And so I think it's actually very important that we also be having a conversation with the regional allies, China, Japan, South Korea, and others, about the collapse scenario. What happens in that scenario? How does that work? How can we ensure that that doesn't then turn into a regional conflict?
Congressman, do you want to respond there on the question of whether our leverage in sanctions is fundamentally different? And then, Tony, I want to give you a chance to jump in and defend the Iran deal.
I remember I remember the arguments made during the Reagan administration about why we should not put sanctions on South Africa at a time when South Africa developed a nuclear weapon, was using apartheid, and Nelson Mandela had been imprisoned at that point in time, I think, for 27 years. And all of these arguments were articulated. I later had the opportunity to speak to a former South African official who told me we would have lasted another 10 days had we not capitulated. And they had to capitulate because, in point of fact, the power of those sanctions to bring the economy to a halt and implode. And yet, it was a debate here, yes, but by a vote of maybe 80% in the House and close to that in the Senate, the members overrode the president's veto in order to deploy those sanctions on South Africa. The result was that the government in South Africa made the decision to hand off to the international inspectors that atomic weapon. Elections were held instead of apartheid, and Nelson Mandela was released from prison. I would suggest that we hear this from every administration, but until we have exhausted this possibility and had behind it the same amount of focus that we did then, we won't know what the result will be.
So I thought Mike was appropriately gentle, fair, fair and balanced, which I appreciate. Look, without going into too much detail, rehearsing a lot of history, you know the saying, "Don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative." We inherited an Iranian program that was very, very close to threshold status. Almost 19,000 centrifuges, enough LEU, if further enriched, for 10 to 12 nuclear weapons, 4 pathways to a bomb, through Natanz, through Fordow, through Iraq, and also potentially through a covert program that we had virtually no visibility on. All of those things were arrested as a result of the agreement. And Mike's right, this is not a permanent solution, but it is one that puts much further into the future the prospect of Iran getting that status. Now, it's also worth remembering that even when various components of the agreement are no longer being applied, there are permanent features to Iran's obligations. It is permanently barred from developing a nuclear weapon under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it reaffirmed in signing the agreement. It cannot do weapons-related research. It has permanent inspection obligations, including under the additional protocol. All of these are real and serious. And the bottom line is, when the various pieces of the agreement start to lapse, we will be in no worse shape than we were when we negotiated the agreement. In fact, we'll be in far better shape because all of the tools that we had in terms of enforcement will remain in place, except we will have much greater knowledge of the people, the places, the technology, the supply chains of the program as a result of among the most intrusive inspections in the history of arms control. We will have our own time to have further perfected our means of dealing with any kind of breakout, should that happen. And again, Iran will remain under these very serious prohibitions. So I think all of that is vitally important as we look at this and consider it. The challenge now, I think, is twofold. I would agree with Mike that we should continue to look for ways going forward to, if we can, appropriately tighten what we can do. Now, there were very good reasons why ultimately things like missiles were not in the agreement, because we had a multi-party agreement. It was not the U.S. and Iran. We had multiple parties. The only thing there was consensus on was that the nuclear agreement needed to be just that, a nuclear agreement. All the other issues, many of which we would have loved in an ideal world to bring in, our partners were not prepared to bring in. So we had to deal with that real world aspect of the agreement as well. We would be in a very bad place if we were deemed responsible for cratering the agreement for the reasons that Mike said. We would wind up isolating ourselves, not Iran. Iran would get most of the benefits from continuing to engage with Europe and Russia and China. It would be freed from a number of the restrictions that are in place. That's not a good place to be. So my concern, I have to tell you, is this. For those who are adamantly opposed to this agreement, I think the game is to try to provoke Iran into taking steps that would cause it to crater the agreement. And then we would say, oh, it's not our fault, they did it. And we would be in a situation where we would lose the benefits of the agreement. Not only lose the benefits of the agreement, but perhaps put ourselves and the Iranians on a trajectory that leads to conflict. So the hard part here is getting the balance right between taking the necessary steps to push back strongly against nefarious activities by Iran, whether it's support for terrorism, whether it's meddling in other countries, whether it's its own human rights abuses, without doing it in a way that gives the hardliners in Iran good cause to crater the agreement. Final thing I'll say on this, and this always fascinated me as we were debating this over the years. When you talk to various colleagues about Iran, you get the impression that some of us believed that Iran is the only country on earth that doesn't have politics, when in fact it has among the most intense politics of any country that I know. And there is a powerful debate that plays out every day in public in Iran, in the Majlis, in the media, about the nuclear agreement. And while from the perspective of the Obama administration, the nuclear agreement was just that, a nuclear agreement, even if there was occasionally talk about other potential benefits to the agreement, the reason we did it was to answer a really tough security problem. Interestingly, though, the opponents of the agreement in Iran, in the Majlis, in the conservative media, they see it as much more than a nuclear agreement. They see it as a Trojan horse that has the potential to open up Iran to the world and undermine the revolution from within. Now, That's pretty interesting when you factor that in.
Absolutely. Yep, please.
So on North Korea, I wouldn't want to leave anyone with the impression that I disagree with Chairman Royce. I completely agree that trying sanctions is very important, especially until we have exhausted that. My concern, and my guess is that the chairman shares this concern, though I won't speak for him, is that if it doesn't work, the alternative, the plan B, can't be acquiescence to a North Korean ICBM, which I consider just an unacceptable threat to the United States. And so I think it's very important that the administration also be thinking about what are those alternatives, even if they're very unpleasant alternatives to think about. Because if we get them to the table and all we can get is a freeze for freeze or something like that, I'm not sure that that's worth our while. On Iran, I know far better than to debate Tony Blinken on this, so I'm not going to do that. What I want to do, though, is pick up on two of the points he made, because I think it's very important now to be as forward-looking as we can. When it comes to things like, for example, the weaponization research, which Tony mentioned, which is barred by the agreement, I think the details now really matter when it comes to implementation, because what we've seen so far in implementation is that, yes, while those things are barred, they're not reported on in the IAEA reports. Hopefully they're being reported on sort of privately at least, because the IAEA, it's not part of the IAEA's mandate to report on that particular aspect of the agreement, nor am I aware of inspections to ensure that that part of the agreement is being upheld. So those are two details which I think you could try to fix. You could try to address in the implementation in terms of strict enforcement that the Trump administration has talked about. And then in terms of where are we in 10 years? Are we in a better position? Is Iran in a better position? I don't think we can take that for granted. If you look at what Iran is doing around the region now, they're in Lebanon, they're in Syria, they're in Yemen, they're trying to push into other places. It's going to take a lot of work to ensure that in 10 years, when this agreement the restrictions start to expire, that we are in a better position in the Middle East, and Iran is the one which is deterred and contained and not sort of on the march in the region. And I think that'll be a very important pillar of the Trump administration's policy, and I think we're already seeing it in Syria. And there's a lot of concern out there about what's happening in terms of U.S.-Iran conflict in Syria. And of course, people are always right to be concerned when we're engaged in these types of military activities. But I think people also need to recognize that deterring Iran and ensuring that Iran feels as though there's going to be a cost anytime they challenge American interests is absolutely vital if we're going to have stability and peace in this region.
And it's a lot easier to actually deter them when they don't have a threshold program, which we managed to eliminate, at least for far into the future, through the agreement.
John, to you, in both cases, successive administrations of both political parties have said the military option remains on the table, both with respect to Iran and with respect to North Korea. And almost in the same breath, members of those same administrations would say, but don't worry, we're not really going to do it because we know it's insane, right? Is that still true? And I mean, you don't work for this administration, but I mean, they're facing a version of exactly the same conundrum you did.
Yeah. Despite my title, I don't have any particular insight into how. But I think Tony can speak to this as well, and the chairman as well. I mean, regardless of what you think about the ultimate decision-making capacity by President Trump, there's a lot of reason to have very strong faith and support for Secretary Mattis, for Chairman Dunford, for Vice Chairman Selva, for Secretary Tillerson. The entire U.S. government security apparatus understands very well the risks both in the Korean Peninsula, where we have effectively managed a very delicate deterrent relationship for over 50 years, and they understand very well the risks involved in a new military conflict in the Middle East, this time with Iran in a much broader way than we're seeing today. So I think any president who is sworn to protect and defend the Constitution in America will say that we have the strongest military in the world. The proliferation of nuclear weapons is a unique threat to our security, and therefore we're never going to say never. But at the same time, we have seen what happens when you use military force to deal with a proliferation problem, real or imagined, in the case of Iraq. And so there's a reason you want to exhaust all of the other alternatives, including sanctions, including diplomacy, including negotiations. Because in the end, as Tony said, and I think everybody up here would agree, we do need to be prepared to protect ourselves and our allies should these agreements or these programs move in a way that threaten us. Now, that being said, I'm sure everybody up here got calls from their mothers and relatives when the aircraft carrier was reportedly steaming towards North Korea and saying, oh my God, is Trump going to go? We're not going to attack North Korea with one aircraft carrier. Right? I mean, there's no way on God's green earth that our uniformed military are going to say to the president, oh yeah, we can do that with that. Right? I mean, you're going to see a large-scale military buildup, whether that is in the Middle East or in Korea, with large-scale deployments of air capacity, ground troops, aircraft carriers, multiple evacuation of American citizens. There's a whole buildup that leads to that. Where I really worry is not that we're going to go, it's that things will escalate out of our control. And this is where, and I think it's important to focus on this, it's critical that the United States reassurance value to our allies be as strong as ever. We can't have daylight between ourselves and the Europeans when it comes to Iran, and we can't have daylight between ourselves and South Korea and Japan when it comes to North Korea. And so having those relationships as strong as possible so that we can manage escalation. Tony would know this better than I, but how many times over the last 20 years have we had to work very closely with South Korean presidents so that they don't overreact to a North Korean provocation? And the same thing is true in the Middle East. We have to manage these relationships because they can get out of control quickly, and in an environment where we're not communicating with North Korea and we're not communicating with Iran, just as I think we have serious concerns about the relationship with Russia, there's the potential for escalation that could get out of control quickly, and everybody recognizes that that's something we won't be able to control.
Anthony, can I ask you a version of the same question? Has the threat of U.S. Military action sort of become hollow in dealing with these two cases?
I think something that John said earlier, 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, when all North Korea did was stack missiles in a tower or use it in the same facility. We knew where that facility was. We could have a lot of nice, pretty pictures of it. And if we wanted to make a show of it, we could do that. But now, I mean, there's many more unclassified pictures, so that's a good thing. But maybe you don't follow the same Twitter I do, given my focus and because I'm a nerd. But like there are many people who spend a quick amount of time geolocating it. But the question is North Korea is moving that around the country. So I think that's already taken away. And I think it was mentioned, there's a significant amount of artillery, and Seoul, they will destroy most of Seoul, and we will eventually win, but at what cost? And I think John's right. I mean, the way I saw the multiple aircraft carriers there was more to deter North Korea from attacking South Korea and getting something that would run out of control. And it's also a message to China. Sanctions are one thing, but the Chinese interest is not in Chinese interest to have two aircraft carriers in the region. It's also not in their interest to have those aircraft carriers doing exercises with Japanese Navy and the South Korean Navy, right? So there's already one aircraft carrier permanently stationed in Japan. It would not surprise me if one of the efforts here is to somehow have one on rotation nearby all the time. I think that's going to be a message to China to try and get them to try and solve this issue before we go the sanctions route.
Congressman, you want to jump in there?
Well, I just, thinking this through, I think it would be amazing if, because we did not want to put sufficient pressure on China, we were not willing to be consistent. We forced the Treasury Secretary, or Assistant Secretary, Stuart Levy, to lift those sanctions back during the Bush administration. We are so deferential. I mean, the question here, we have an alternative, right, to going to a war footing about this, and the alternative is to be serious about cutting off the hard currency. And if through these many years we had been serious and consistent, it's entirely possible we could have caught Beijing's attention. Let's at least try and say, okay, the Security Council has passed their resolution. Let's at least be serious in the Senate after waiting for over a month with these provocations, and now, by the way, with the death of Otto and the grieving today of his parents at his funeral, let's be serious enough to pass this legislation, and let's go in and explain to Beijing that no, push is not going to come to shove. Instead, we expect something of you. We know that the motors and the wiring were made in China. We do know also that the gyroscopes were made in Japan and somebody black marketed that. But let's explain that the subsidy is going to stop. Otherwise, yes, we're going to take economic reprisal through sanctions to your financial institutions. It seems to me astounding that rather than do that and play that out and force people's hands, we would consider a military strike. Why? Especially given the history of where sanctions have worked in the past, where we've really applied them and used our considerable economic pressure to make sure we follow through. So no, that's the next order of business, and the Senate should act immediately. Thank you.
If I can just, one, agree entirely with the congressman, with the chairman. And also, there's a follow-on point we have to make. So I think that conversation with China is critically important. I think we have to not only say, but act in a way that shows that this really is our top priority, it is a core interest. But there's a second conversation we have to have with the Chinese to get them in the game, which is to understand if they do cooperate, and if we are successful, either North Korea falls or North Korea capitulates and gives up its program, that we're not in this to reunify the peninsula to get up on the Chinese border. That there is a security situation that China will prefer to the status quo or to the trajectory that we're on. And I think there have been some efforts along those lines over the last couple of years, but unless we build up the relationship with China that they actually believe it, and unless we can communicate it effectively, I worry that they'll just continue to balk at that pressure. I think we still have to move in that direction. I think secondary sanctions are a critical component of that, but we've got to have, if we're going to squeeze the tube of toothpaste, we've got to open up the top.
Tony has a plane to catch, and I want you all to be able to hear Nikki Haley, so we're going to wrap a little early. But is there anything we've left here that anybody is just dying to respond to? So well trained. Thank you all. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.